My dear friends, let us consider certain matters today which will embrace many of the well-known truths known to anthroposophists. You are probably acquainted with the nature of the description I gave in my book titled Theosophy, of the worlds in which man has to live between death and a new birth. I propose today to give some further descriptions of these from a different point of view. Imaginations are in that book largely used in the description of the soul and spiritual worlds through which man passes when he goes through the gate of death in order further to develop for a new earth life. Today I shall take the subject not so much from an imaginative standpoint as from that received through inspiration. In order to arrive at an understanding, let us begin with the experiences we have in our earth life. At any given point of time between birth and death, we face the world in our physical body, that part of our being which is enclosed in our skin and contained in our physical body we call our human nature. We assume that in the human being not only are there hidden anatomical and physiological processes at work, but that soul and spiritual processes also play a part therein. In speaking of ourselves, however, we mean what is enclosed within our skin. We work out into the world. The world is around us, and we call it our external world. Now we know that we make picture concepts of our outer world. These picture concepts live on in us. Thus we have the outer world around us, and in our soul life we have reflected pictures of the outer world. When we are passing through the life between death and a new birth, we are in the world which here on earth is our outer world. All that we can see or sense as our outer world then becomes our inner world. We call that our ego. Just as we now consider our lungs as belonging to our ego, so in the life between death and rebirth, we look upon the sun and moon as our own organs within us. The only outer world which we then possess is ourself, as we were on earth, our earthly organs. When we say here on earth that within us are lungs and heart, and outside us a sun, a moon, and a zodiac, so in the life between death and rebirth we say, within us zodiac, sun, and moon, outside us lungs and heart. Everything we now have within our skin becomes, to an ever-increasing extent, between death and rebirth, our outer world, our universe, our cosmos. Our perception of the relation between world and man is completely reversed in our life between death and rebirth. So when we pass through the gates of death, we have at first a distinct picture of what we were upon earth, but only a picture. Imagine this picture making the impression of an outer world upon you. At first, this picture is as a sort of phenomenon, and during the first period after death, the consciousness of what we were on earth as human beings takes the form of recollections and pictures of earth life. But these rapidly come to an end, being replaced by the perception ego, world, universe, man. This perception becomes more and more vivid. But you must not imagine that the lungs appear as they do now. They do not present an aspect which could compare even with our view of the beauty of sun and moon. For that which is then lungs and heart is much grander, much mightier than the sun and moon seen here by our human eyes. In this way we get for the first time a true impression of what Maya really is. People speak of Maya, of the great illusion of the earthly world, but they do not really believe it. They secretly believe that everything is as it appears to their earthly eyes. This, however, is not the case. The lungs and heart are only illusory structures. In reality, our lungs are only one very marvelous part of our cosmos, and so is also our heart. The heart in its reality is something much more majestic, much grander than a sun. We see the gradual appearance of a great cosmic world, and we can say, below this cosmic world are the heavens. But what we really mean is, quote, below it is that which is preparing the human head for its next incarnation, close quote. What is below is above. Everything is reversed. All the forces are there which prepare a man for his descent to earth and enable him to stand on both feet in his next earthly life. This can be summed up in the following words. The nearer we approach a new earth life, the more does the universe man seem to contract. We become more and more aware that this majestic universe man, more especially majestic in the middle of the time between death and rebirth, that the majestic universe man shrinks together in a sense, and the planets which we have within us, and their weaving, become that which vibrates and pulsates in our human etheric body, while the fixed stars in the zodiac become that which forms our life of nerves and senses. It shrinks together, takes first a more spiritual form, and then becomes etheric body. When it has become quite small, it is taken up into the mother's womb and clothed with earthly substance. Then comes the moment when we approach earth life and feel that the universe, which was formerly ours, is disappearing. It shrinks together and becomes smaller. And this produces in us the longing to return to earth, once more to unite ourselves with a physical body, because this universe, in a sense, withdraws from our spiritual vision. We see how we became human, and we have to reckon with quite different periods of time. The life between death and rebirth is one of centuries, and if a man is born in the 20th century, his descent has been slowly prepared since as long ago as the 16th century. He himself has, in a certain respect, worked upon his earth conditions. Your great-great-grandfather, living, say, in the 16th century, fell in love with your great-great-grandmother. They felt the impulse to come together. In this impulse, you yourself were working from the spiritual world. Then, in the 17th century, a less remote great-grandfather loved a less remote great-grandmother, and again it was you yourself who brought them together. You selected the whole generation in order that your father and mother might finally be there. In that mysterious, indefinable element which is to be found in earthly love, play the forces of those seeking incarnation in the future. Hence there is never complete freedom or complete consciousness in the external conditions which draw men and women together. These things are quite beyond the understanding of the modern man. What we know as history today is in reality only quite external. We do not know much of the history of man's soul in our present external life. People do not realize that the souls of men had quite different feelings in the 12th and 13th centuries. In the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, men still knew of the mysterious forces working into their souls, out of the spiritual worlds, from the human souls therein, though the knowledge was dreamlike, and did not exist in the clear conscious form in which I have now given it. Not much has been said in the West concerning repeated earth lives or reincarnation, but there always have been men who knew of these things. The churches have always eliminated and condemned all thoughts of repeated earth lives. But you must nevertheless bear in mind that many people in Europe, down to the 12th and 13th centuries, were aware that man passes through repeated earth lives. But then came the age in which the humanity of the West was to develop intellectuality. man had to attain to free spiritual activity, to freedom. Free will did not exist in the ancient days of dreamy clairvoyance, for there is no free will. At the most there may be a belief in it, in those human relationships which, let us say, are governed by earthly love, as I have just described it. The interests of the souls about to descend to earth must always be reckoned with. Humanity must, however, become more and more free as the development of the earth goes on, for only thus can the earth attain her goal. For this purpose, intellectuality was necessary at one particular epoch, and that epoch is our own. For if you look back to earlier conditions of the earth, when men had dreamy clairvoyance, there were always spiritual beings living in that dreamy clairvoyance. Man could not say at that time, quote, "My thoughts are in my head," close quote. That would not have been true. In those olden times he had to say, quote, "I have the life of angels in my head," close quote. And later on he had to say, quote, "I have the life of elemental spirits in my head," close quote. Then came the period, lasting from the 15th to the 19th and 20th centuries, during which man had no longer anything spiritual in his head, nothing but thoughts, mere thoughts. But man had nothing more of a higher spiritual nature within him, nothing but thoughts. He became able to form pictures of the outer world. Could man have become free as long as spiritual beings lived within him? No. They guided him absolutely and entirely, and gave him everything. Man could only become free when he no longer had spirits to direct him, when he only had thought pictures. Thought pictures cannot compel you. When you stand before a looking-glass, no matter how wicked the man in the looking-glass may be, he can never give you a real box on the ears, because he is not reality. He is only image. When you are making a decision on some point, that can be reflected in a mirror picture, but the picture itself can make no decision. In an age in which intellectuality fills our heads with nothing but thoughts, free will arises, for thoughts cannot compel. If we do but allow our moral impulses to be pure thoughts, as I have described, entitled The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, also known as The Philosophy of Freedom, also known on this website as Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, end of aside, we may then acquire freedom in our age. The age of intellectualism had to come. It may perhaps sound strange, but it is the case that the time when men were to develop mere intellectualism, mere picture thinking, is now over. It came to an end with the 19th century. If men now continue to form mere picture thoughts, these thoughts will fall victim to the Ahrimanic powers. The Ahrimanic powers find through them an entrance into man, and he yields up his freedom to them. Humanity is facing this danger at the present day. Humanity is now confronted with the possibility either of learning to understand the spiritual life, of understanding that there is a reality such as I described in the beginning of this lecture, or of denying it. In the latter event, man loses the possibility to think in freedom, and Ahriman and the Ahrimanic powers begin to think in him. And then the whole of humanity enters a condition of decline. Thus it is in the highest degree necessary that more and more men of the present day should understand that we must return to spiritual life. People must seek to develop in themselves the feeling of the necessity for a return to spiritual life. For if they do not do so, humanity must succumb to Ahriman. Thus, seen from a higher standpoint, the position of humanity is extremely serious. We ought to give this thought the precedence over all others, and consider all thoughts in the light of this. I hope that what I have said will have made it clear to you that the life we pass through in the spiritual world, between death and rebirth, differs completely from our life here between birth and death. For this reason, pictures taken from earth life, no matter how ingenious they may be, cannot adequately characterize the real spiritual life of man, and we must slowly and gradually rise to the understanding of the reality in the spiritual world. Let me give you examples of this. Let us suppose that a man leaves his earthly body here and passes over into the spiritual soul world. And let us further suppose that someone who has acquired initiation knowledge in the inner sense is enabled to observe souls in their life after death. Of course, much preparation is necessary to make this possible, as well as a certain karma, which connects man here with the soul on the other side of death. The point is that we must acquire a possibility of making ourselves understood by the dead. I am now speaking of extraordinary, difficult spiritual experiences, for it is generally easier to describe the spiritual world than in the slightest way to come near to a dead person. People are very wont to think that there is no difficulty in approaching a dead person, but it is much more difficult to do so than to acquire ordinary spiritual knowledge. Now I should like to tell you of a few peculiar circumstances connected with communion with the dead. In the first place, it is only possible to associate with them if one can transfer oneself into their memory pictures of the physical world. The dead are still attached to human language, and indeed to the particular language native to them here, but their relation to language alters. One notices, for instance, on coming into touch with a man who has died, that he very soon ceases to have any understanding for nouns, for substantives. Substantives are words which the living here may direct to the dead, but the dead, if I may make use of the expression, simply do not hear them. On the other hand, all verbs, words of action or activity, are intelligible to the dead for a comparatively long time. As a general rule, we can only come to an understanding with the dead when we know how to put questions to them in the right way. Sometimes it is necessary to put these questions in the following way. One day we concentrate in profound stillness on the dead man, and on an actual concrete experience that we shared with him, and which he held dear during life. In his soul, after death, there are more pictures than abstract conceptions, and it is therefore best to concentrate on. In this way we can gradually come near to the dead man. As a rule, one does not receive an answer immediately. Often one must sleep over it, perhaps for some days, and then the answer may come. But one can hardly ever get an answer from the dead if the question is clothed in the form of substantives. One must try to clothe all substantives in verbal form. This is absolutely necessary. Verbs are what the dead understand best, and the meaning must be made very clear. For instance, the dead could never understand the word table. But if one can represent the activity of making a table, the process of becoming, one is then able gradually to make the dead understand, and one will get an answer, but always in verbal form. Indeed, frequently not even in verbal form, but in what we on earth call interjections, exclamations. The dead always speak in letters, in combinations of sound. The longer man remains in the spiritual world after death, the more does he accustom himself to speak a language which can only be assimilated when one gains the power of distinguishing in earthly speech not the abstract significance of words, but the content of the feeling in the sound as well. I spoke of this in the lectures on education. In the letter ah, we feel something like wonder. We take this wonder into our own soul if we do not merely say ah, but ah. Ah, I am astonished. The wonder passes into me. That is the meaning of ah. Now, if I add M and say Mach, I have a continuation of what made me astonished, as though M were a step further, and I have now completely entered into the feeling of astonishment. We often get answers from the dead in these combinations of sounds. The dead do not speak English or German or Russian. They speak in such a way that their language can only be understood by the heart and the soul, when these are in close connection with the ear. I have already told you that the heart is more majestic than the sun. To earthly sight, the heart is somewhere within us, and if we dissect it, it does not seem to be so very beautiful. In reality, the heart is in the whole of man. It permeates all the etheric organs and is also in the ear. We must become more and more accustomed to this language of the heart, which is the language of the dead. This we can do if we gradually discard everything of the nature of a substantive and pass on to what is of the nature of a verb. For a long time after death, the dead can more or less understand that which is active, which is becoming. Later on, however, they understand a language which is no real language at all. What we receive from the dead, we have then to translate into earthly language. Man grows out of his body gradually into the spiritual world, and there his whole soul life is different. As the time gradually approaches for man to descend to earth again, he must once more alter his soul life, for he has to perform the mighty task of first constructing the astral form and then the etheric form of the future physical being on earth. What we accomplish here on earth is external work. Our hands are busy doing external things. Between death and a new birth, our soul is busily occupied in constructing our body. It is nothing more than semblance that man comes into being through heredity. Through inheritance it comes about that he is clothed in the most external physical sheaths. But the form of his organs he has to build up himself. I shall give you an example of this, and I should like to borrow a glove. When man approaches earth life, he still has sun and moon within him. These gradually shrivel up. In your cosmic life, you feel your sun and moon organs shriveling up, just as here you might feel both your lungs shriveling up. And then something severs itself from the sun and something from the moon. Now, instead of having sun and moon within us, as was formerly the case, there is a kind of image of the sun and moon before us, two glittering, shining, gigantic globes. One is the spiritualized sun, and the other is the spiritualized moon. The one is bright and shining light. The other glimmers, is more warmth-giving and fiery, retaining the light within itself, as though egoistically. These two globes, which sever themselves from the cosmic human being as he is transformed, the Adam Kadmon, who still exists today, draw nearer and nearer to each other. Descending to the earth, we say, sun and moon are becoming one. This is it which leads us from great-great-grandmother, great-grandmother, grandmother, finally down to the mother who is to give us birth. We are being guided by a sun and moon, and in the process they draw nearer and nearer together. A task then confronts us. We see as a single spot what is still distant in the human embryo, and we see that which, as combined sun and moon, has become unity, drawing near to the mother. This approach can be described approximately in the following way. Think of this glove as being the united sun and moon before you. You then know, when my cosmic consciousness has completely disappeared, when I pass through a darkness, that is after conception, when man enters the embryo, I shall have to turn this inside out, so that the inside will become the outer. That which was sun and moon must be turned inside out, leaving a small opening through which I must pass with my ego, and this will form the image of my human body on the earth. That, my dear friends, is the pupil of the human eye, EYE. Out of what is now unity, the two eyes arise, like two mirror pictures. These are the two human eyes, at first united as one united sun-moon, which then turns inside out. We are then confronted with the task, accomplished unconsciously, of turning the whole thing inside out, of turning the inner into the outer and slipping in through the small opening. It then all divides again. In the embryonic state, two physical pictures are formed. For the physical embryonic eyes are two pictures, originating from the sun and moon. In this way, by gathering together all we experienced as universe, and giving it definite form, we develop the single parts of the human organism, and these are then clothed and enveloped in plastic matter and substance. They take on substance. But the forces must be developed by the man who fashions them out of the universe. For instance, when we pass through the sun as it stands in the sign of Leo, either at birth or before, we do not then form the I from the sun and moon, I-E-Y-E, for that took place previously. But during this time, we unite ourselves with the inner being of the sun. If we could see this inner part of the sun, it would have quite a different appearance from what the physicists of the day imagine. Their physical conception is so void of imagination. The inner essence of the sun is not a ball of gas. It is something which is less than space, from which space is indeed eliminated. If we picture space as spread out, as pressing in upon us, we must think of the inner essence of the sun as a suction, as negative space, emptier than space. Very few people can get a real conception of this. When we pass through this, we experience something which can be developed and subsequently form the human heart. It is not correct to say that only the eyes are formed out of the sun and moon. The heart, too, is formed out of them. But the heart can only be formed from the sun when the sun has within it the forces of the constellation of Leo. Thus, man actually builds up his whole human organism, either from the movements of the planets or from the constellations of the stars of the universe. The human organism is an image of the world of the stars, and a great part of the work between death and rebirth consists in working to form our body out of the universe. The human being as he stands on the earth is a universe, but a universe that has shrunk together, contracted. Yet natural science is naive enough to believe that man only originates from the physical human germ. That is just as stupid as to look at a magnetic needle which points toward the north at one end and to the south at the other, and to imagine that neither end believes what the other is doing. Such a conception seeks the directing forces within the magnet itself, instead of seeking the whole earth as a magnet. This is to believe that man arose from the human germ. Man does not originate from the physical human germ, but he comes from the whole universe. And his life of soul and spirit, between death and rebirth, consists in working upon the supersensible, etheric human soul form, which then contracts to such an extent that it can clothe itself in physical substance. Man is in reality the scene of action of what the universe, and he himself with his transmuted forces, accomplishes in respect to his physical body. Thus man gradually breaks away from language, as he knew it, of the substantives, and assimilates to a special language of verbs. And he then passes on from language to the inner perception of the world of the stars. He then lives in the world of stars, and begins to organize and construct out of that world what he is to be in his next incarnation. Thus, as a result of the transformation of language, he passes from the physical into the spiritual, and in the same way, as a result of the transforming of the universe, he passes back again to become man. We can only understand the life cycle of man between death and rebirth when we understand how the spiritual and soul element, which then loses itself in language, becomes one with the world of the stars, and then draws back again out of that world. At the time of the mystery of Golgotha, many people were still aware of these things. At that time, no one believed that Christ Jesus was a being who had developed on the earth. Everyone believed that before the mystery of Golgotha, Christ Jesus had been in that world to which we ourselves belong, between death and rebirth. And they reflected upon how he had descended and passed into the earth. Initiation science had been rooted out of the Roman world, and only the old dogmas were allowed to remain. One society, in Italy in particular, in the 4th century of our era, made every kind of effort to prevent the old methods of initiation from being transformed into the new, so that men should only retain the knowledge of the outer physical world and know of the supersensible worlds. Only the old dogmas, which they gradually accepted as concepts with their intellect alone, which they could no longer understand but only believe. Thus the knowledge which once existed was destroyed and reduced to a knowledge of the earth and a mere belief in another world, until finally the belief itself dwindled away to a series of dogmas that were no longer understood and were simply a point on which man's faith could rest. What is the belief of modern man, who no longer holds to the dogma of the Trinity? He believes in a vague, general, spiritual element. But we must get back to a true vision by means of which we can find our way into the spiritual. That is to say, we require a science of initiation, which speaks to us as follows: the human eye, EYE, is worthy of all wonder, for it is really a little world in itself. It is not a mere image. It is a reality for the reasons I have just given you. For at one time in our life, between death and rebirth, our two eyes were one. And this unity later turned inside out and was really a fusion of the images of sun and moon. We have now two eyes, because if we had been organized to see with one alone, as did the Cyclops, we never could have developed the ego in a visible world, but only in a world of feeling. Helen Keller has a different world of feeling and perception from that of other people. She can only understand things because language was explained to her. We develop an ego feeling through being able to lay the right hand over the left. Especially when we place the symmetrical members one on the other, we develop a subtle, fine conception of the ego, because we cross the axis of the two eyes in visualizing. Just as we cross our hands, so do we cross the axis of our two eyes whenever we look at anything. In the spiritual world, the two material eyes are one, and this single spiritual eye lies behind the root of the nose, and is then transformed into the two eyes. Man can feel himself to be man, because he has a right and a left side. If he possessed only right or left, if he were not a symmetrical being, there would be no perception in the world. Man would never acquire an ego complete in itself. When we transform the two images of the sun and moon into one, we are doing this for our future incarnation, where we realize that we cannot dissolve into the whole universe. We cannot be a sun man with the moon man separate from us. We must become a unitary being. This sun-moon, human eye, comes into existence in order that man may feel himself a unitary being. The sun-moon, human eye, is transformed into the form of our own eye, EYE. Our two eyes are simply the images of the unitary sun-moon, human eye. That is what I wish to tell you today, my friends, about the experiences we have in the spiritual world. Experiences which differ so much from those we have here in the physical world. These things are connected in the way I have described, but processes are reversed. If we could turn a man inside out as I turned the glove, so that the inside becomes the outer. Then the heart, for instance, becomes the surface of the human being. He would not continue to live as physical man, as you can well believe. If you could take hold of his heart, turn him inside out, like a glove, he would no longer remain a man, such as he is here, but would extend and spread out to a universe. For if we can concentrate on one point in the heart, and possess the power to turn ourselves inside out in spirit, we ourselves become the world which otherwise we experience between death and rebirth. That is the mystery of the human inner being, which only in the physical world cannot be turned inside out. But the human heart is itself a world turned inside out. Thus is the physical earth world connected with the spiritual world, and we must accustom ourselves to this turning inside out. Unless we do so, we shall never attain to a conception of the true relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world.